Chad Robinson here, the host of The Practical Broker and mortgage broker at 360 Best Interest Mortgages. Today's episode features a very special guest, Bruce Firestone. Bruce Firestone has a Ph.D. in urban planning. He's a realtor, he's a coach, he's one of the founders of the Ottawa Senators NHL hockey team, and a complete wealth of knowledge. In today's episode, we go into a deep dive on clients and people that are moving from the residential real estate game into the commercial real estate space, and some things that they really need to look out for, some opportunities that they're coming up with, as well as, areas to navigate and what to look for. In the second half of the episode, we go into this amazing discussion about how the current world crisis is really affecting real estate and what are some opportunities and what are some risks that are going to be presented. I hope everybody enjoys the episode and have an amazing day. So thank you, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Practical Broker podcast. Chad Robinson here, mortgage broker and host. And I'm really excited today to be joined by a good friend of mine, Bruce Firestone. He has a Ph.D. He's been a real estate investor, a business coach. He's a real estate broker, essentially on Explorer Realty. And of course, as he's really well known here in Ottawa, as one of the founders of the Ottawa Senators. Did I cover everything there, Bruce? I think it's your resume can go on for quite a while. You've been involved in so many projects.
Well, I've been a real estate guy. I've been a university professor. I've been a hockey guy. I'm a real estate investment and business coach. One of the problems I had, Chad, with the media when I was being more closely covered by the media than I am now. As you know, they have more important stories to cover than somebody like me. But one of the problems that they had when they covered me more closely was they couldn't really fit, me into like a little tiny box. If you've got Prime Minister Trudeau, he's the Prime Minister, or Mr. Trump, he's the President. But when you do as many different things as I've done, it's hard to categorize the person, and that the mainstream media don't like that much, and I was never very popular with them.
Yeah, that's okay. That's because, entrepreneurs and trailblazers, they're not always popular.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, you're an entrepreneur too. I know that. And we tend to maybe follow the rules, but maybe not all of them.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, and that's what makes us who we are, right? And why we
I
can.
think so, yeah.
Oh, well, listen, thank you very much. As you know, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on this call today in this podcast is on the Practical Broker podcast. I try to give some actual practical advice. There's so many podcasts that just talk in theory and they don't actually give actionable items for people, especially in the real estate. Right. I thought you were one of because you've done so much coaching and your education as a professor as well. I have so many clients that want to transition from residential investment properties going into the commercial, and it's sometimes it's an inch, but it's also a mile wide, that chasm. And that's where I wanted to really go into today, get into that. And then a little bit after we get into that, obviously the world's in crisis right now. We're in the middle of the COVID crisis. And, how investors are faring with that, both residential, commercial, and some opportunities that might lie once the dust settles. And how to make sure we're all on a soft landing from our real estate portfolios and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Great. Let's go.
Perfect. So when your clients are thinking about that, they've owned a typical investor, you bought one or two properties, you have a duplex or a triplex, and they want to transition up. They're always looking bigger and better.
Right.
What's the first step? What do you tell your coaching clients that step one, what to start looking for?
I get it. So just so you know, the difference between residential real estate and commercial real estate is different as running a shoe store and managing Facebook. Mm-hmm. Mark Zuckerberg runs Facebook, and Bill and Jane run a shoe store. They're not the same businesses, and I think it's really important for people to recognize that. Mm-hmm. And the skill sets that investors and people that you and I talk to, entrepreneurs, have developed, when they own a few duplexes, a couple of triplexes, maybe a templex here and there, they have developed some skills, no doubt about it. And they say, well, now I'm ready to build a 50-story, office building.
Yeah.
Oh, really? And I wrote an article a few years ago now that if somebody gave you an inexperienced commercial person a free office building in, say, downtown New York or downtown Toronto or downtown, Hong Kong, they wouldn't actually be doing you a favor. And you must say, what? A billion-dollar building in the middle of downtown Hong Kong, free? I'd take that any day, except that that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is all of your competitors who are very sharp and have been trained in this field for decades, some of them centuries, have been at it for centuries, they'll steal all your tenants. Yeah. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2009, 2010, when we had that the last economic meltdown, right, which was called the Great Reset, yeah, and this one that we're going through now is about to be much worse. Mm-hmm. But we went through it before in 2009, 2010. And a friend of mine, he was not a client of mine, just a man I know, he's an acquaintance, had a 40 or 45,000 square foot vacant commercial space in Canada, which is in the west end of Ottawa, and it's a big part of the tech community in this area. Yeah. And it was vacant for 3 or 4 years. Now, if you have a 40 or 45,000 square foot retail plaza or office building that's vacant, you can have operating costs and property taxes and maintenance costs of about, 15 or as much as $20 per square foot per year. So right, we'll just pick a number. If it's $15 per square foot per year, if those are your property taxes, operating costs, utility costs, all that stuff, because you still have to heat and cool the building and take care of it. Yeah. And it's 40,000 square feet. It means you're losing $600,000 a year. Yeah. And in Ottawa, Toronto, San Francisco, Boston, Los Angeles, Seattle, Austin, Nashville, these wonderful cities in North America, they have vacancy rates in residential that are practically zero. But in commercial, the vacancy rates could be anywhere from 6, 7, or 8% to as much as 20 or 30%, right, and that is a killer. So even if I gave somebody who's inexperienced a free office building, I might not be doing them a favor.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned an office building of that size. One came across my desk in a smaller market here in Canada, newer construction, and it's exactly that. It's 20% occupied. Investors are trying to buy it. They're bleeding almost the number you pegged off. It was 600 grand a year.
I have a lot of experience, and there was a recent trade of 3 office buildings in Ottawa, and I won't mention it because it's kind of unfair because I have a bit of inside information. A really nice, well-located complex. And when I looked at the vacancy rate, I almost fell off my chair, 25%. If, Chad, in your residential real estate portfolio, if you had 25% vacancies, you'd be out there jumping off a bridge. Well, not really, but it'd be a big problem. So let me just point out a couple of pros and cons. Okay, so I do have lots and lots of clients. My coaching practice is about 420 people, so it's not huge, but it is what it is.
That's significant.
And it's grown a lot since you and I last talked, and a lot of these people do want to transition. And so some of the pros, I wrote them down before we got on this call, is there's no RTA, there's no Residential Tenancy Act to deal with.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. In commercial, if a tenant stops paying you, you give them a letter within a day or two, and 15 days later you could distrain, which means you basically lock them out. Anything that's left inside, you're the landlord, you own it, right, and in 15 days you're looking for a new tenant. So that's obviously a big change, because in the commercial world, governments generally, not just in Ontario but around North America and probably overseas too, they view commercial transactions as being between 2 equal parties. Right. So tenants are knowledgeable and well advised, and of course landlords are experienced and well advised. So the government doesn't tend to get involved in residential transactions. They assume, and rightly so in most cases, that landlords have been doing this longer than most tenants, and so it's a bit of an imbalance. So the governments have stepped in all over the place to sort of rebalance it. Right. And some people think it's gone too far the other way.
Right. Absolutely. So maybe before we get too far down this conversation, the definition of commercial is really broad, right? Commercial could be a chip stand, or it could be a mixed-use residential building, all the way to office buildings.
Yeah. So I do have some. I'd like to tell a story, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
All right. And I'll start the story with the ending.
Okay.
All right. I like to tell stories.
I love it.
And ask my wife, I only have one addiction. It's not to alcohol or drugs. It's to writing.
Yeah.
It's my only addiction.
It's
okay.
awesome. It's a good addiction to have.
Thank you. So anyway, so the end of the story, the lesson that I learned was to stay away from big mules. That's an expression I learned from a young woman who is a client of mine. She lives in South Carolina. I said, what the heck is a big mule? Well, in her world, a big mule is like an equity lord. It's a big player in the real estate industry. It would be like you and me challenging Usain Bolt to a 100-meter race.
Right.
He's probably going to win.
Yeah.
Now, I actually timed myself. I can beat Usain in the 100-meter, race. Just so all your listeners know, as long as I'm allowed to start at the 90-meter mark.
Exactly.
Okay, so
I was thinking grabbing a motorcycle, but
yeah, well, motorcycle would be fine too. But I can actually beat Usain, but I have to start at 90 meters, and for you, probably 80. But I'm a lot older. So what she meant by that is there's a lot of people who've entered into the commercial sector, real estate investment trusts, REITs, pension funds, insurance companies, banks, publicly traded firms, and they generally have a cost of capital that's 1% or lower. Yeah. And you're a mortgage broker, an excellent one too. And you know that if I was a young person investing in commercial, my loan to value ratios are probably going to be 65%. In residential, it might be as high as 80 or even 95%, depending on where you're at. Right. But in commercial, you're going to need a lot more equity. Maybe 35% of the deal has to be equity. And you're competing against very large players who have a very low cost of capital. My cost of capital in commercial might be anywhere from 4.5% to 6.5%, and their cost of capital is 1%. So they're going to beat the heck out of you. Right. And I learned that because I was building, in my early days, I was building office buildings and shopping plazas, and guess who I ran into? I didn't know they were called big mules, but that's what happened. So, so that's kind of what I would stay away from. But there are some things that you could do, and I will talk about how you might pivot to something that is amenable to young entrepreneurs, or maybe not so young entrepreneurs. But first, I'm going to tell you the story, the beginning of the story. Awesome. So when I was doing my Ph.D. in urban economics at the Australian National University in Canberra, my dad came to see me. I think it was in my last year, and he said, "Bruce, I need you to come back to Ottawa." My dad was living in Ottawa, Canada. I was living in Canberra, Australia. You can't really get much further apart unless you're in the Antarctic. And he comes to visit me, and my wife and I had had our first baby, and he wanted to visit his newest grandson. And so he came to visit, and he said, "I just need your help back in Ottawa for 6 months, just 6 months." So in 1983, I came to Ottawa from Australia, and I found that my dad and I think 3 partners had invested in roller disco rinks. Do you even know what they are?
I do know what a roller disco is. I've never been to one.
Possibly, you're way too young to know what a roller disco rink is.
I think it'd be fun if we had one now.
I guess. Well, you couldn't go today.
No,
so I didn't know what they were. I mean, I don't know if they had disco music in Australia, but I didn't know anything about it. So I went to one of these things, and they're huge buildings. They're like 1 acre warehouses, with high roof, and it's all on one level. And they've got this beautiful wood floor in there, and they got the disco lights and the disco ball and Donna Summer's music. Donna Summer, she was, I guess, the disco queen back then. Yeah. And so I didn't have roller skates. I rented a pair of roller skates, and you skate around like this, and music plays, and then it stops. And so, I guess I'll have to stop. And then everybody goes quiet, and then music starts and you go in the opposite direction. Right. So I did that for an hour, and I thought, this is really bad. And I took my roller skates off. I thanked the young lady who had rented them to me. And the next day I called up the other 3 partners, and I said to them, "Guys, we have 6 roller disco rinks." They said, "Yeah." And I said, "You guys, we own half of the operating business, and they own half of the operating business, and we own half of the underlying real estate, and they own half of it." I said, "I'll trade you our half of the operating business for your half of the real estate business." And the 3 men, they were older than me, I was in my 20s then, said to me, "Oh, you're a young man, we don't want to take advantage of you. The operating business, the roller disco business is a cash cow." And I said, "You keep the cow. I don't know anything about roller disco. I really don't. and you obviously do. So you keep the cash cow and you just rent from us. And so they said, well, we'll take pity on you, Bruce. And they made that trade. 18 months later, they went bankrupt.
Right.
And so now we owned 6 giant warehouses, completely empty.
Right.
Now, some people might consider that a problem, but an entrepreneur is, he's never dead. He's life challenged.
Right.
And, that's on my tombstone, wouldn't back down. So what I did was, we were very lucky, really, nothing to do with any skill on my part, is it was the beginning of the tech boom in Ottawa.
Right.
And there was a company called Mitel. You know Mitel? It's
remember that, yeah.
I guess a communications company. And there were many others. And there was in the 1980s, around that time, this would have been, I guess, the mid 80s or something like that. There was a management theory called management by wandering around, MBWA. And the theory was that if you're an executive in a tech company or any company, you should be able to see all your people. You should be able to wander around, because the theory, and I think it's still true, is that the most valuable meetings that you will have are often at the water cooler, at the photocopy, just by accident. They're not all scheduled like this podcast.
Right.
And so, everybody wanted to be on one level. And then we had these 6 giant 45,000 square foot empty warehouses, and all these wonderful tech companies moved in. And so about a year later, we had really good tenants paying way more rent.
Right.
And I was able to get them reappraised. And as you know, in commercial, and of course you're an expert at this, to appraise something, all you need to know is what is the net operating income for that property and what the applicable cap rate is. You divide the net operating income by the cap rate, you get a value.
Right.
Presto magic, all of a sudden, these empty warehouses were worth quite a bit of money with these wonderful tech companies paying really good rents.
Right.
And so you're able to refinance and pull out a whole bunch of cash. And that's how I got started. And here I am 37 or 38 years later, still here.
That's amazing. I've never heard that story. That's an amazing story.
Well, yeah, I don't really tell it that often. But so just to put a footnote to it, though, I started to build more office buildings and shopping plazas. I ran into these big mules, and I was renting office space for $18 or $19 per square foot triple net. Triple net means that in addition to paying their base rent, tenants are paying operating costs, and they're paying utilities, and they're paying property taxes, and in some cases even percentage rents, which means you get a percentage of their revenues. So I was getting $18, $19 and plus, and all of a sudden I had these pension funds offering the same kind of space that I was offering for $6.
Wow.
It would be like working for $18 or $19 an hour, and then your boss comes along and says, Chad, Bruce, sorry, tomorrow it's $6. Yeah. That's kind of happening now to a lot of people, if in fact they even have a job. So,
right.
You would have to be kind of, stupid to continue to do what you do, knowing that you're going to get run over. So I did pivot. So I wanted to tell your listeners what I pivoted to, and it still works today. So I pivoted to mini offices. Do you know what a mini office is?
I do, but share. Let's tell my
Okay. Well, the modern term for it is co-working space.
Right.
So we became the largest operator of mini offices in Eastern Ontario. These are offices fully fit up. Back then, it would have meant you have furniture, you have a phone, you have a fax machine. How cool is that?
Yeah.
You have a photocopier, you have reception. Everything is there, so you can start operating your business within an hour.
Right.
And today, the modern version is the co-working spaces. So we had a company called Terrace Corporate Centers Limited, which was very successful.
Yeah.
And I started another company called PETA, P-E-T-A.
Okay.
That does not stand for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, nor does it stand for people eating tasty
right.
animals. It stands for Presidential Executive Travel Apartments. And it was Airbnb before there was Airbnb.
Right.
And it was very successful. We had really good relations with tech companies, and when people would come from out of town, they would stay for a month or 2 months in a beautifully furnished 2-bedroom apartment or condo or townhouse rather than staying in a hotel, and it was very successful.
Right.
And we also got into mini storage, those mini storage buildings where you throw the garage door up, you put your stuff in, close it.
Yeah.
Real simple business, but holy
Right.
smokes, that was a great business for us.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we did was we started to build small plazas as opposed to large plazas. Until the internet can, drill your teeth or help you with some physiotherapy, these little plazas that we built and managed very successfully, I might add, they're kind of internet proof, at least for now.
Right.
And we did two other things. We also went into land development in a big way. So we were putting roads and water mains and sewers in, and we were selling lots, not to home owners. I didn't really like the business to consumer market, but I like the B2B market better. It just suited my personality. So we would sell, if you were a home builder and you needed 30 lots, you'd buy them from us, and it was a very good business. And then the last thing that we did, to avoid the big mules, is I bought 600 acres of land in Canada, in the west end of Ottawa, and we bid for a National Hockey League team, which turned out to be the Ottawa Senators. Right. And we built a building that we called back then the Playland, is now Canadian Tire Center. And the idea was to buy 600 acres, which we did, for $12,000 per acre. That was the average price. So we spent about $7.2 million on this piece of land. Right. But after we put the Sens there and the Palladium there, Canadian Tire Center, in the last generation, the prices for land there have gone from $12,000 an acre to $832,000 an acre. So, wow. So those are the kind of businesses even today that smaller investors can actually get into. And many of my clients who are pivoting to commercial are doing these kinds of things, staying away from the people who will run you over.
Absolutely. So what is it about the smaller shopping centers that protects you from, coming up against the mules?
Well, first of all, a REIT is not going to buy, I built a 10,000 square foot plaza in a little village, Dunrobin. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's in the west end of Ottawa. Yeah. I owned some land around there, and I was building a subdivision. So I like the idea of having, there were a few hundred homes we were building there, and having a shopping plaza, because I really like the idea of giving people a place to walk to. If your child wants to go get a popsicle, in many subdivisions that we have built in the last 50, 60, 70 years, you have to put them in the car. Right. You just can't walk anywhere. Yeah. We're still building subdivisions with 3,500 homes in a row without a single job or shop or pub or nothing to walk to, nowhere to go, and every trip is a car trip. I didn't believe that. So in Dunrobin, when we were building a few hundred homes, I built this little tiny 10,000 square foot plaza, and I put two young women, Julie and Cindy Delahunt, in there. They ran the Dunrobin Meat and Grocery. Then there's a Lickbo there, if you know what Lickbo is.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't know what Lickbo is. What's that?
It's the LCBO.
Oh.
My kid, I have 5 kids. They all call them Lickbos. Yeah. So LCBOs, that's Liquor Control Board of Ontario. That's where we buy our booze. Yeah. When I came back from Australia, Chad, I was super, super amazed to find out that you had to go to a government liquor store in Australia. Back when I was there, you drive up to the petrol station, and right next to the petrol tanks were stacks of Tuies and Fosters. Yeah. And there were no laws against drinking and driving, not that we should go back, but it'd be nothing to put a Tuies and Fosters next to you. And I used to hang glide, fly off mountains with my hang glider, my boys and my group, and we'd be driving down these back roads, and a police officer would come, "Hi, mate, you want a Tuies or a Foster's? What do you prefer?" You'd hand, from the passenger seat to the driver, you'd hand the police officer a Tuies, and he'd give you the thumbs up and drive on. Well, that's obviously changed for the better now, but anyway, that's kind of what we were doing. So where was I? I completely lost my train of thought.
No, I love that story. That's awesome. I know it was a small, the small commercial.
So the small plaza. So a couple other things that we do to make sure that we don't get run over. First of all, we pick great locations where you have lots of drive-by traffic, lots of walk-to traffic. So, lots of homes that are you can walk to these plazas, which I think is important. The other thing that we've been doing a lot of in the more recent times is we've been adding to all of our plazas what I call a Playland. And very simple things. Do you know what pickleball is?
I do.
Yeah, okay. So pickleball is the fastest growing sport in North America. And the reason for that is that it's played with a wiffle ball and paddles, right? So if I were to play tennis with my two sons, there's no chance. Or with my grandsons, there's no chance. I mean, they can hit the ball at 85 miles an hour, and Pops is a little bit old now. There's no way I can run it down. But no matter how young they are and how fast they run and how hard they hit it, in pickleball, when they hit that ball, it comes off the racket and stops. So I can run it down. I can actually be competitive. So older people, younger people, kids can all play together. So we've been adding to our plazas, pickleball courts, volleyball courts, bocce courts, outdoor ping pong. So the theory is if Chad had a little pizzeria here, and right next to the pizzeria was a pickleball court or a beach volleyball court, people would really enjoy that, but they might drink more beer and order more pizza too.
Yeah. That's a neat
And
idea.
it also provides great entertainment for people sitting on the deck, watching people like me struggle in pickleball or something, right?
Right.
So we can do things as small investors that will really differentiate us. That trust me, a REIT is going to go and try and buy, the Eaton Center do they still call it the Eaton Center in Toronto?
I think so.
Yeah, they're going to try and buy the Eaton Center. They're not going to come to Dunrobin and buy my miserable little 10,000 square foot plaza.
Right.
But those things are really great to own.
That's awesome. That's a you know what? That's a great idea. Like you mentioned before, you'd like to animate your properties, and so you're animating.
We do that in commercial too. You and I have talked about lots of animation ideas for homes. Adding a basement apartment, putting a coach house in your backyard, adding tech packages, storage sheds, workshops, you name it. We add them to our residential portfolios. But you can do the same in commercial. There's lots of really cool stuff you can do.
That's a great idea. I love that. And then, the small towns, like you said, that walkability is.
That's really important. I talked to Jonathan Westeindy from Windmill Developments. He's a fairly young developer I have a lot of respect for. And the projects that Windmill does that are very walkable, because they do some really great buildings, both residential and commercial. And he said, the few that were not walkable, that you're kind of out in the suburb where it's hard even to get a bus, he said the sell-through for those has been very slow. So he said, no more of that.
Interesting. So what would your first steps be if you're telling these investors, I want to get in these smaller plazas and these smaller things? Like you said, they might already own a 6-plex or a 10-plex, and
right.
What is that?
Well, my first advice is you should not go into any form of real estate, whether it's residential or commercial, without a business model.
Right.
And people go, well, business models, that's only for, tech.
Mm-hmm.
They think about, the iPhone, and the iPhone has a business model. The business model is that Apple gets some of the subscription fees. Mm-hmm. Apple gets some advertising. They get some app store sales. I mean, there's all kinds of revenue streams implicit in this iPhone. Right. And Steve Jobs, unfortunately, passed away now. Steve Jobs understood that the business model would make the iPhone successful, not necessarily the tech. And the iPhone, we did an analysis a few years ago on the iPhone, and it's, in my opinion, the most profitable single technology ever created. And it's not because the technology is better than Samsung or Google Pixel phones. It's because of the business model behind it. Right. iTunes back in the day and Apple Music today and all the other revenue streams. So people come to me and say, well, I'm going to do this project. So I'm going to build a 4-plex in Russell. I'm going to buy some property in Moose Jaw. And then after that, I'm going to go to Arizona and buy some stuff. And then I saw a plaza over here that is in the middle of nowhere, but I'm going to buy that too. Those are just projects. They're kind of random.
Right.
And the people who make the most money, Chad, in pretty much every business, are the people who are focused on a business model. A business model is something that's scalable and repeatable.
Right.
And so if you were developing, triplexes, and you were really good at that, or you're developing small retail plazas, stick to it.
Right.
And it's just like, people who are saying, I can play baseball and I can play football. But at some point, you have to choose. Am I going to be a baseball player? I think the young fellow who won the Super Bowl last year could have been a baseball player as well, the quarterback there, Mahomes. Mm-hmm. And he's a magnificent talent, fun to watch. But even somebody who is as talented, really world-class, maybe a class of 3 or 4 or 5, in the world with his skills. Even he has to choose. And so for us mere mortals, you have to have a business model and you have to stick to it.
Right. Absolutely. No, that makes sense. So focus, and know your stuff really.
Yeah, know your stuff. And I know you do. I mean, I've seen some of the buildings that you've done and renovated and done structural changes to them. I mean, fantastic work you and Muriel have done.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of investors would say to me, and we've shifted gears now. The mortgage business is so focused, so busy in the last couple of years. We're just focusing on that.
Oh no, I completely understand that, but I mean, you know, don't undersell yourself. I've seen the stuff you do, and I'm not just saying because I'm on the call with you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and to your point, what we did was we focused on a very narrow area and a very narrow demographic. And I said our tenants that we wanted to deal with were millennials. They were between 20 to 30, fourth year university to 1 or 2 years post grad, and we had a very defined tenant model.
Exactly.
Built to that tenant model. And touch wood, you know, we've done really well. There's very little vacancies, happy tenants. So it's worked really well.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm agree. But what people don't know, and I'm going to tell you, so don't listen, Chad. What I'm going to tell everybody out there in podcast land is that Chad understands the zoning bylaws and ordinances better than almost anybody else I know, including most urban planners who work for the city. And he's able to get the most, which means the highest and best use out of every one of the properties that he has owned and developed. So there you go.
Thanks for the plug. I appreciate that. That's awesome.
Well, it's true. And that's what I'm talking about. Don't be a dilettante. So to people who say, I'm going to do 20 things and I'm going to do them all well, you're probably kidding yourself.
Absolutely. 100% agree. So Bruce, if you could go back in time and tell yourself anything back to the younger Bruce, what wisdom would you be passing on?
I wish you hadn't asked me that. I saw that in your questions that you sent me. I said, oh my gosh, I know exactly what I would do. Yeah. So I would go back to the 39-year-old Bruce Firestone. And I would say to him, it was at the point in my career, Chad, where we had decided to buy that 600 acres of land in Canada and to bid for a National Hockey League expansion franchise, which was eventually a success.
Of course.
But what I should have done when I was 39 is we owned 16 ground floor condos at Holland Cross, if you know where Holland Cross is in Ottawa. And what had happened was we owned, my wife and I owned 16 ground floor condos. And this was a project developed by a Montreal-based family by the name of Berger. And I don't remember whether I called David or his brother, but I called one of the Berger boys and I said, how are sales, condo sales going for Holland Cross? And they said, great. What developer will tell you my sales are sucking? Yeah. The only word you ever get is great. I said, that's awesome, David. That's fantastic. And that's good. How many of your ground floor condos have you sold? I think I'll have to get back to you. David, how many have you sold? None. So the reason for that is obvious. I mean, most people want, second, third floor penthouse. They want condos that are higher. The higher you go, the more expensive they are. But you're away from the traffic and the noise. But what I really liked about those 16 condos was they all had individual doors to the outside. So you didn't have to go into the main building to get to these 16. They all could be accessed from the outside. So it was perfect for presidential executive travel apartments. Right. So I said, David, I want to buy all 16. And he's probably looking at his phone in Montreal saying, I have a sucker on the line. So he sold me, I think, each of them for like $112,000, which at that time was like a steal, even then. I bought 16 of them. But what I didn't tell David was that we were going to use them for executive travel apartments. Like I said, Airbnb before there was Airbnb. Yeah. And so that when we would have a technology executive or somebody coming to visit the government of Canada to do some work for a month or 2 months or 3 months, they could come at 3 o'clock in the morning. And back then we wouldn't have had electronic keyboards, but we would have had those old lock boxes, where you put the or you push the numbers in. Yeah. And so people could show up at 2 or 3 in the morning. They could enter the premises. They wouldn't bother the people on the upper floors, the important people up there. And it was a very successful business. And we had, I think, another 12 of them, 12 townhouses in the West End. So we had 28 units. And this is back in the 90s, I guess.
Wow.
And they were so 28, and there was no mortgages against them,
Wow.
and they were producing about $80,000 a month in gross operating income, about 50,000 in net operating income.
Nice.
So what I should have done is I should have put those units in my wife's name, because I'm an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs do take risks.
Yeah.
And it's a public story. Many of your listeners who will watch this podcast or listen to it know that the Senators did very well in our first year in the second smallest building in the NHL. We made about $9.6 or $9.8 million in earnings.
Right.
But by the mid 2000s, unfortunately, the Canadian dollar had gone from 90 cents when we bought the team to 62 or 63 cents.
Right.
And the NHL and NHLPA, the NHLPA are, they're smart people. They decided to price all contracts in US dollars. So our payroll went from 6.5 million Canadian dollars in our first year, 92, 93, to about 84, 85 million by the mid 2000s, and the Sens went bankrupt.
Right.
And so everything I owned, everything, my house, thousands of acres of land, all those buildings I had built had run away. But can you imagine that, restarting your career, not from zero, which would have been great, but from a negative position, because I still owed money to a bank and to Canada Revenue Agency,
Right.
which is the Canadian equivalent of the IRS. And those are not good people to owe money to, they have a nasty habit of wanting to be paid. So I was starting from a negative position. So I had to go back to school, Ph.D. notwithstanding.
Yeah.
And I think I took 8 courses and 8 exams to become a real estate broker, became a real estate investment and business coach. And I had to restart my life. But can you imagine what a difference my life at that point would have made if I had put that one asset, which I really should have done, instead of being in my name and my wife's name, in my wife's name. And she's a wonderful girl, but she's a stay-at-home mom, and with very low risk. And we would have, back then we would have had $50,000 a month in income, and today much more. Well, maybe not in the time of COVID-19, but hopefully we'll get back to a more normal way of doing things. So if I were to tell that 39-year-old Bruce, that would be for sure I would tell him that.
Absolutely, yeah. So protect your assets, right? A little bit of
yeah. It's the shoemaker's son who doesn't have shoes.
Yeah.
I take care of everybody else, and then oops.
It's funny you bring that story up, and that's again something I didn't know about you. I had a customer today that a purchase that they were doing. They were buying a commercial property,
Yep.
and was falling apart. And for various reasons, some on their part, some on the seller's part. And usually when commercial transactions go bad, everybody's blaming each other, right?
Oh yeah.
But they were lucky in the sense that they had a purchasing company that's buying in the company name and that has no assets. So, they said to their lawyer, well, they can sue me. There's nothing in there.
Well, yeah, that's not unknown.
Yeah, it was. So, they got some good advice at that start. And, but yeah, so it's this time we're living in now. Obviously, it's a bit, we're in the middle of the end of March. So depending on when you listen to this podcast, in the middle of this COVID crisis, and you're getting, as you mentioned before we jumped on this call, that all your coaching clients are freaking out, and
many of them, yeah.
Yeah. And so what are you telling them? What's your feeling going on through this crisis?
Well, I'm very hesitant to use the word crisis. I almost never send out an email marked urgent. If somebody sends me an email marked urgent, it's probably the last one I'm going to read that day.
Right.
But I do think we are in a crisis. I don't think there's any way around this. I think it is. And I did a little bit of homework. I did a recent article for Ottawa Business Journal. I don't know if I sent it to you, but I will. And what I did was I did a bit of research, and I could not find, Chad, since the dawn of the industrial age in the early 1700s with the invention of the steam engine, from that time to the present, I could not find an example where a major economy, in this case China, where their GDP, gross domestic product, dropped by 40% in 3 months. Yeah. That's what happened in China in the first quarter of 2020.
Wow.
I could not find another instance of that. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, Germany and Canada and the United States, industrial production in those 3 countries did fall by over 40%, but that took about 3 or 4 years.
Right.
So I have not been able to find a comparable time when our economy has dropped by 40%. I saw today that Goldman Sachs is estimating that the U.S. economy in the next 3 months will contract by 34%.
Wow.
And I'm predicting, I mean, for what it's worth, that Canada will do worse. I think we will drop by 40%, and in 3 months. So we are in a crisis. There's no question about that. So what I said was a few things, all of things that I think people will for themselves figure out for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, you should conserve your cash.
Yeah.
You should. So if you have a deal, I've had many of my clients who are in the middle of buying commercial property or residential investment property. Yeah. If they are still unconditional, they are getting out of those deals. They are. Not all of them, but many of them are. Because it's the other side of things. You know, you asked me about the SWOT thing, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Over the next 18 months, there will be tremendous opportunities, in my opinion. In 2009, 2010, I sent out an email to my client base, and I said, this is an historic opportunity to buy real estate.
Right.
And, you know, maybe I can't do anything else, Chad, but maybe I can talk.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm pretty convincing. You know, I convinced the NHL to give Ottawa an expansion franchise in the middle of a tough recession in the 90s, and right. we were in the process of losing two teams, Quebec Nordiques and the Winnipeg Jets.
Right.
We've since got the Jets back, but the Nordiques are still missing. And so, you know, it's incredible what the opportunities are likely to be. And so a building that, you know, one of my clients, an industrial building they could buy today for $875,000, which they waved goodbye to, I think, yesterday. They probably could pick that up for half price in 6 months to 18 months.
Right.
And listen, it's the harsh reality is, you know, you buy real estate when everybody else is selling. Yeah. No one likes to hear that, but it is true. And in the last Great Reset, one of my clients who was working for the Florida Panthers in South Florida, he bought not one but two homes on the same street, both of them under foreclosure, brand new homes, beautiful homes, not palatial, but they were advertised for sale for $875,000, brand new. Yeah. He bought them from a Colorado-based investor who owned them for $350,000 each. Yeah. Wow. And then that was 2010, 2011. And then by 2015 or 16, they had bounced back to about $850,000. He sold one of them, paid off the mortgage, and now he lives in his own home. It's worth $800,000 or $900,000, or at least it was before COVID-19, and with no mortgage and a few $100,000, you know, in the bank. Right. That's the kind of opportunity I think that we're going to see in Canada and in the United States. I mean, when your economy drops by 34%, that is very, for an economy the size of America, that's just huge. Unbelievable.
So what do you think, you know, being the commercial expert you are, I've been reading a lot of things about, you know, our whole work styles now are changing. I mean, this is right. known. What's happening in the office space market, do you think, and the retail?
Well, you know, you must have read my article over my shoulder, because I deal with that in my OBJ article. All right. But I can tell you that what I say in my article, and like I said, after this conversation is over, I'll send it to you. And it has been published today, so you're quite free to share if you want with your readers. Yeah. And I'm going to send you the extended version because my editor always cuts me back. I'm too wordy. I'll send you the extended version.
Perfect. And I'll include it for the listeners. I'll include this link to the article in the show notes.
I think you should, because I think it's time for Canada and the United States, frankly, for the whole world, to stop fooling around. Yeah. You know, we should not, you know, if somebody in your city or town wants to build an office building that will house 500 workers, he or she, they should not be allowed to build that office building. End of story. No more office buildings unless you have 500 micro suites in that building. Right. So, you know, if you're going to use my iPhone as a prop. So if you have a building, you know, from here down has 500 workers, from here up, it has to have 500 studio apartments or apartments or something. Yeah. We got to stop fooling around because, Chad, we talk about going green. We talk about it. And the idea of being green, here's the typical yuppie's view of going green. You get up in the morning, you go to your home gym,
Yeah.
You get in your beautiful $120,000 Tesla, you drive an hour through traffic to go to an office building that has horrible fluorescent lights, windows that don't open, bad air, and while you're there and your suburb over here is empty, all the break and enter people go from downtown to your home to break and enter and steal whatever they can. And then when you get back in your expensive Tesla and you go back to your home, those same people go downtown and do whatever they do downtown overnight. It is a terrible model. We built better towns and cities in the 1880s, 1890s, 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s than we do now. So we have to stop, because if you talk to Toby Lutke at Shopify is a big tech company in Ottawa, he'll tell you that we don't have any problems attracting people to come to Ottawa to work for Shopify or in other tech, but we have trouble taking hold of keeping them. And the reason for that is there's nowhere for these people to live.
Right.
And if I went to Toby or to other tech executives and said, look, Chad and I are going to build this nice office building with 500 places for your workers, but we're also going to have 500 micro suites. I don't think you would be leasing those micro suites or studio apartments to individuals. I think you'd be leasing them full floors to these tech companies.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a kind of a hybrid. I'm giving people a free model here. And so, and if you think about going green, you're in a home office now, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I am too. And so, my CO2 production, if I put a full tank of gasoline in my car, this was not new, I've been using a home office for a while, that tank of gasoline will last a few months.
Right.
I have an e-bike, if you know what an e-bike is.
Yeah.
Little electric scooter. I like using it. I actually bought it for my wife, but she crashed it and said, I never want to see this again. So she gets the car and I get the scooter, and I use the scooter. It costs, I think, 47 cents a kilometer. That's right, 0.47 cents a kilometer to drive, about a half a cent a kilometer to charge it, and it goes 40 kilometers. It's very, very inexpensive. So if we're serious about building better towns and cities, they're going to be walkable, and we're going to get serious about, it boggles my mind that in Los Angeles, people have sometimes 2-hour one-way commutes to get to their job. It means 4 hours a day, 20 hours a week. It is out of control. We've got to be smarter.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's going to happen out of this,
I do think so. And in fact, even before I published this article, I gave it to our head planner, our top guy in planning and economic development, Steve Willis, to look at, and his people, because I said, I've been hired as a special advisor on the new official plan for the city of Ottawa, which was due out in 2021. Now I have no idea if we're going to make that deadline. But I said, we just got to stop. The next person who applies to the city of Ottawa for a friggin' office building, we should tell them no, unless you build 500 studio apartments in it. End of story.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, make it mixed use, make it more dynamic and livable, and
and more walkable, more interesting. Who the heck wants to spend the half of their lives in I was about to say some rude word, but in a traffic jam? No, thanks.
Absolutely. Well, it's very interesting. What now that we're all used to working from home, especially this goes on for a period of time.
It's likely to.
Which is likely to, right? Are we going to need these 50,000 square foot monster buildings anymore?
Well, I think we will still need them, but we'll need less. And because I still think a tribal gathering. So let's say you and I had a company with 40 or 50 employees, or for that matter, 400 or 500 employees. We're still going to want to bring them together from time to time. Like Zoom is a fantastic. I don't know if you saw the meme that was spreading on the internet. The real cause of COVID-19 was Zoom. Because Zoom had a public listing last year, and their Zoom stock is zooming, right? Yeah. Because the number of new subscribers is incredible. And thank God for AWS, Amazon Web Services, because otherwise Zoom would never be able to handle this. We couldn't even talk on this thing today. So yeah, we still need office buildings. I call it for tribal gatherings, for those water cooler things that the photocopier, the management by wandering around stuff. But we're going to need a lot less of it.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a really good plug out to Zoom. Not that they're listening, but I've been a member using this for years, and all on this podcast we've not noticed a single blip, and this system must be inundated.
I'm telling you, the people at Zoom they're smart people for sure.
Hats off to them for sure. Um, so on those opportunities, you think, is there a specific asset class people should be looking for, or is those small shopping plazas?
I do have to give people a bit of a heads up because you're old enough to have seen a few of these setbacks. I'm old enough to have seen a few more, and your parents and grandparents and my parents and grandparents saw much worse. I mean, as bad as it is right now, let's remember that my parents and grandparents and your grandparents went through the Great War. The Spanish flu epidemic that killed 25 or 30 million people around the world in 1919. They went through the Great Depression of the 1930s. They went through an incredible war, World War II. There was the Korean War, which Canada was involved with. There was the Cold War. And, and these things lasted a lot longer than 2 weeks or even a few months. So if I'm very confident that Canada and Canadians will be able to handle this, and we just have to recall the greatest generation I think ever. These are the people who took us from the horse and buggy to the moon. They are now passing from the scene, and like you said, all hats are off to them. What they faced down, you cannot imagine what it would have been like to live in the United Kingdom in 1939 in London and face the onslaught that they faced. It's just unimaginable. As bad as 9/11 was, it was terrible. My heart goes out to the people who lost their lives that day. But what Churchill said, I would remind Canadians today, to quote, sort of paraphrase, I guess, Winston Churchill: we should never, ever, 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 ever surrender.
Right. I agree. Yeah, 100%.
So you wanted to know what kind of asset classes. I was going to just finish with this. So everybody needs a home, and it is a travesty that we have forgotten how to provide affordable housing for our young people and how to provide enough housing for all of the people who are homeless. That is for sure on your generation and my generation, because the generation before us certainly knew how to build houses for returning veterans after World War II. My father worked for C.D. Howe, the minister of everything, in the 1940s and 50s. And between the two men and their department, they established Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, now called Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And we knew how to build great cities and provide enough housing, affordable housing for everybody. So it is on this generation that we have failed. That's political, urban planners, everybody, developers. So we have to fix that. But one thing I would like to say is we do need housing. And so as an asset class, when things get really tough as they are now, residential values do decrease, but they decrease very slowly. Commercial values drop out a bit. So if you're looking at an asset class to invest in right now, residential is probably going to sustain itself better than, say, a retail or office. Especially office is going to get whacked. Industrial, however, tends to be sort of in between. So commercial is doing this, residential is doing this, and industrial is kind of in the middle. Because we need people to make surgical masks. We need people to make ventilators. We can't just rely on China to make ventilators and surgical masks for Canada. To heck with that. So there is another lesson here, Chad, which is that cities and towns have to be much more robust and much more self-sufficient. So for everybody, I'm encouraging all of my clients, this year, you plant a backyard garden. Don't fool around. You plant tomatoes and beets and potatoes. And it wasn't that long ago, everybody in Canada had a backyard garden and we could grow our own food. They've been doing that in Russia for, 1,000 years. So if you're going to invest in an asset class, residential is probably going to be, the least affected. Having said that, for myself, I happen to really like it, industrial. I own some industrial property, and I love the client base. If I have an industrial tenant and something goes wrong, he or she is very unlikely to call me. If the toilet's plugged, they'll unplug it. If somehow the truck damages a wall, they're not going to call the landlord. They're just going to fix it. They pay their bills, and there's going to be tremendous opportunities to pick up industrial product. And if you wanted to experiment with something, industrial is the way to go. For another reason as well. Now, I won't keep you too much longer because I know we've gone on probably too long. But The other part of the industrial thing is that we're heading towards a gig economy.
Yeah.
A lot more people, they're predicting 15% unemployment in the United States. It will be higher in Canada. It wouldn't surprise me if it was 20 or 25% in Canada, which is comparable to the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So we're in for a heck of a ride. So when we come out of this, it's my view, and I believe this for a long time, that everybody on this planet should have a personal business for life. I call them PB4L, personal business for life. You've heard me talk about that before, and we were headed in that direction anyway. But for the millions and millions and millions of people who are being laid off, including some of my kids, they're going to want to develop a personal business for life, a gig. And when you have a gig, let's say one of my tenants is she makes furniture from wood pallets. Who knew? Another one operates a few lathes. He does prototyping for the tech industry. Everybody is going to. Some people are making wine. Pickling fruits. People are knitting baby caps. I don't care.
Yeah.
You have to have a personal business for life, and they are going to need workshop space. So whether you're an investor in residential, build a workshop in your backyard. Trust me, there'll be a lineup of people to rent it. Right. And if you have an 80,000 square foot industrial building or an 8,000 square foot industrial building, divide it up into small workshops. There'll be plenty of people out there knocking on your door. I need this space.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's an amazing business plan. I would agree with you. That's out of the silver lining. I think that maybe coming out of this is a resurgence of the buy local, but really a true heart to buy local. Keep whatever country you're in.
My wife is planting our garden as we speak. Even before this crisis, there's a movement sweeping the world called backyard homesteading. If any of your listeners want to hear from me, like I said, I've written I don't know how many books. I've kind of lost track, and I've probably got thousands of articles that I've written on various things, including backyard homesteading. In fact, I'd like to build a subdivision where your house is Chad's house and Muriel's house is here, Bruce and Dawn are here. And between us is a completely open backyard, and that is where you're going to have linear farms.
Right.
Where we can really grow enough food to feed ourselves and our family. And as I said, in Russia for 1,000 years, they're called dashniks. That's a Russian word for gardener. Yeah. And on a very small piece of land, they're able to grow enough for a family of 4. So we can do much better.
Absolutely, we can. Well, listen, Bruce, thank you very much. I'll put all these links in the show notes.
Thanks. And, can I give you my 1-minute sales pitch?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
So I am a real estate investment and business coach. I'm very passionate about what I do. And if any of your listeners are interested in a little bit of help to find the right business model, to help them with their financing, to find the right product, to animate it and add more revenues and new revenue streams, I'm available. I'm going to do this until St. Peter calls me to the big house in the sky. It gets me up in the morning. I'm up early. So you can reach out to me at any time, bruce.firestone at century21, the numbers 21.ca. I'll repeat that, bruce.firestone at century21.ca. And thank you, Chad. Absolutely.
Yeah. And as a plug, Bruce, use to my listeners, Bruce was one of the few mentors that I've had that I found I got amazing value out of in our conversations. And when I hired you as a coach, it really helped me transform and focus before I got into the developing world. What type of property, you helped me craft that design of what type of tenants I wanted. And it was your coaching and mentorship that let me do that. So
well, thank you for that. That means a lot to me.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. And the listeners, I'll put the email as well in there, as long as the link to Bruce's website. And your vision and contribution to Ottawa is really grateful. Thank you, Bruce.
And to everybody out there, be well and stick together.
Absolutely. Help one another. Absolutely. Thanks. Have a good day. What an amazing episode we had today. Bruce Firestone went into a deep dive about so many interesting topics. I can't believe the GDP drops in the country that it has never been seen in the world before, and how this is going to affect us 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now. It's truly a wealth of knowledge. And that article that he discussed is phenomenal. I encourage everybody to go check the show notes and read that link and read that article. Also about, some of these opportunities, how to animate a commercial property. That was amazing. That's, who would have thought about putting a pickleball court next to a small little shopping plaza? But that is a great idea. So, a big shout out to Bruce Firestone. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. As well, he's a wonderful coach. He's a wonderful realtor. If you need to reach him, check the show notes. His contact information is there. And stay safe, everyone.